Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Antonia Show, the Global Elections Edition. Today, we are going to be talking about Mexico, a country in Latin America of approximately 128 million. And contrary to most of the videos I do, I'm not alone today. I thought rather than have me talk about Mexico election, it's better to have somebody actually from Mexico who is much more knowledgeable than I am discuss it. So I brought my good friend Marco Garcia to talk about it. So Marco, thank you so much for being here.
No, anytime, and it's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Um, so I mean, I guess the first question I have for you is, so how is Mexico's government set up? Like, what kind of system does Mexico use to formulate their government?
Yeah, a good intro question. So we are a federal government, very much like that of the United States. Actually, the Mexican system is kind of inspired from what the U.S. Is right now. So, we have three branches of government, the executive, legislative, and judicial systems. They sort of serve as a check and balance on each other. Just for your audience also, if they're more familiar with the US system, it is quite familiar. We have a lower chamber, which is a chamber of deputies, and then we have a Senate. And then the president, for example, also has veto rights. They can nominate people to be a Supreme Court justice as well, for example. Um, and below that, you have state levels, which are also very similar to that of the US. So we have governors, we have state assemblies on each of the 32 states in Mexico. And then below that, you have the more municipal level government. So these are more like small local governments
Mhm.
on each jurisdiction. Perhaps the biggest difference with that of the United States would be the indigenous part of it. So indigenous communities in Mexico are recognized in our Constitution. It is recognized that due to their ancestral knowledge, they have the right for their own form of self-government, even if it differs from what it would be otherwise. So apart from, the federal and state level governments, we also have indigenous communities that they elect their own representatives as well. So those would be the main key aspects of it. So very
Mm.
similar to what someone who is familiar with the US system perhaps yeah,
Awesome.
might know.
Awesome. And so given, all of the positions and branches you just mentioned, so the election is on June 2nd, correct?
That's right. It's coming in hot.
And so what seats, what positions? I mean, is it just the president that's up for grabs? What are people going to be voting for on June 2nd?
It's a great question. It's a very big election. In fact, it's the biggest election in Mexico's history. Over 20,000 positions are up for grabs. Obviously, the main focus is on the presidential election, which is important. We'll get to that, but equally as important, we also have the entire Chamber of Deputies and the whole Senate being renewed. You have various states who also, have a state races for governors. A lot of state assemblies as well, municipal level elections as well, and indigenous elections as well. So it is a very complex election coming up. And
Mm,
like I just mentioned, the biggest one in
yeah.
Mexico's history.
So as you mentioned, we're going to really focus on the presidential election here. And as I understand it, this is a historic election. Is that correct?
That's correct. Apart from the fact that I just mentioned that it's going to be the biggest election that Mexico has ever seen. Right now, it's a politically charged environment in Mexico, very polarized in a way that we haven't seen in many years. There are three options right now in the deck. Realistically, two. It's going to be between Claudia Sheinbaum and Xóchitl Gálvez. We'll delve into that in a little bit. But considering they represent such different interests, and that this president is also going to have to work with a completely new Congress, and that the current president will also have, I believe, at least two picks for court justices. um, this election will really set the sort of the benchmark or the tempo of where Mexico will head for the
Mm,
next 6 years, which is the presidential term. So Mexico only has single terms. We don't do double terms for presidents, but it's a 6-year term.
And I understand this is expected to be the first time that a female will be president. Is that also correct?
Yeah, that's why another reason will be historic. There are 3 candidates, like I mentioned, 2 women and a man. Jorge Alvarez Maínez, but based on the recent polling, it is highly unlikely that he will win the election. So realistically speaking, and of course, in all due respect to him, the election will be decided between the two women right now.
Well, let's jump into these 2 candidates. So, what are the 2 parties that both Sheinbaum and Gálvez belong to?
So they are Sheinbaum is from the Morena party, that is currently the ruling party. And Xóchitl is from PAN, which is a political action national party. Not only do they represent those parties, but they represent a coalition which is also highly unprecedented in Mexican politics. So before 2000, no, I would say, yeah, before 2020, 2018, Mexico didn't really have political alliances. It was pretty much every party on their own. But once the government or the political environment in Mexico started getting quite polarized and it became a matter of, well, every single vote matters, political parties started seeking alliances or coalitions to sort of increase their numbers. So Sheinbaum, for example, she is from the ruling Morena party, but she also has in her coalition the Green Party and the Labor's party. And then you have Xóchitl Gálvez, who's from the opposition, who is from the PAN, PRI, and PRD parties. And then you have Jorge Alvarez Maínez, who is running from the Citizen Movements Party, the Movimiento Ciudadano Party, and they're running by themselves. That also, for example, explain why he's not doing very well, because he doesn't have that coalition that the other candidates do.
And you mentioned that the Sheinbaum is part of the Morena party, which is the ruling party right now. For those who don't know, who is the incumbent and what's the general feeling about him among Mexicans?
Great question. And it really depends on who you ask. So a little bit of context here. Morena is relatively quite a new party. It's less than I'm going to say 10 years, 10, 15 years old. It came about from the current president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador. So he has been a leftist politician, a very good politician as well for most of his political career. He was in the PRI party, which is a center right-wing party in Mexico, who held power in Mexico the entirety of the 20th century up until the year 2000, when the PAN party with Vicente Fox won. But López Obrador was a very popular candidate. He was a very relatively successful Mexico City mayor at the turn of the century as well. He ran for president in 2006 and lost by very slow margins. In fact, he still refuses to recognize that he lost that election. He claims that it was stolen from him. He ran again in 2012. He also lost that election. And it wasn't up until 2018 with this new party that he founded, the Morena party, that he won. And this party would traditionally be considered a left-wing party. So very big on social welfare policies, sort of targeting the institutions or the neoliberal elite institutions, as he would have it, that are vastly unpopular with the average Mexican. So his party is based on sort of bringing a new wind of change in Mexico, and a leftist at that, which is something that before the 2018 election, where Andrés Manuel López Obrador won, didn't happen in Mexico at a presidential scale. Now, in 2018, Morena party absolutely obliterated the competition in all aspects of what that election was. So it won the presidency, it won the Chamber of Deputies, it won the Senate, it won most of its governor races. In fact, Morena now has the most governors in the country. So Sheinbaum, pretty much her task is to continue that legacy of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, which, as I mentioned, is very based on lifting poor people out of poverty, welfare programs, sort of reinvesting where money has traditionally gone into perhaps what people would consider better uses of that money. So that is what Sheinbaum represents.
Mm-hmm.
A
And is it
continuity, if you will.
and is it safe to say that Morena is relatively popular within Mexico compared to previous candidates?
Absolutely. It's so the thing about Morena, it was built around this persona that is a current president who is we can talk about how his administration was relatively good or bad. I'm of the opinion that it was relatively bad on the grand scale of things, but what you cannot deny is that López Obrador is an excellent politician, very charismatic. So the whole party is built around his charisma and his persona, and why he was able to command such a commanding lead in the polls and in the Senate and the Chamber of Deputies. The big question mark right now with Claudia Sheinbaum is whether she can live up to that almost glorification of a persona.
Right.
And that is the main critique that people have of her, is she's not as charismatic as López Obrador, and therefore won't be able to do as groundbreaking policies as her predecessor. I mean, she was already the Mexico City mayor, which is a very significant political position in Mexico. She does have a political career, but what is also undeniable is that Morena, although it remains so hugely popular within the country, that popularity has waned over the past 6 years, primarily due to some of the big failings of the current administration.
It sounds like Lopez Obrador, there's some similarities between him and the other Latin American populists, Evo in Bolivia and Chavez in Korea in Venezuela and Ecuador.
Yeah, for sure. Perhaps the best comparison for López Obrador would be Modi in India, someone where is from the underclass, was from the underclass in Mexico, well, in the case of India, from the undercaste, extremely popular with the average citizen, really willing to take on new colonial institutions that, like I mentioned earlier, are traditionally very unpopular with the average citizen. And that they're able to build this sort of obsession around their persona, and that the party becomes them. Now that can be good or bad depending on how you argue it, but definitely I would say the closest comparison to López Obrador would be, on the global scale, would be Modi.
Awesome. Well, let's dive into kind of the main issues that are important to Mexican voters this election. So can you give me 2 to 3 of the issues that Mexico is facing in the coming 6 years that'll be particularly important for the presidential candidate to address if they're elected?
For sure. The first one that comes to mind, which I think most people would agree is perhaps the biggest issue of this election, is security.
Okay.
One of the reasons why people voted for the Morena party in the 2018 presidential elections is because they proposed a radically different approach to tackling insecurity in the country, which up to that point was not very successful. The previous governments were not very successful in tackling. So when Morena came to power, there was a really big expectation on them cracking down on crime. I believe they promised to have crime rates by the end of the administration. And the reality is they haven't even dropped it by 1%. In fact, so far, it has been the most deadly administration in Mexican modern history in terms of number of homicides. For example, another thing that deeply disappointed voters was that López Obrador wanted to take a less militarized approach to tackling insecurity. So instead of just militarizing the country as it was done in 2006, he thought a much softer, or at least he promised a much softer approach, tackling the root causes of people going into crime, such as poverty, for example. But what he did was actually the opposite. He created a new army called the National Guard, which he claims is a civil-led army, although that is up for discussion, because he wants to now incorporate it fully into the Ministry of Defense. And he's basically further militarized the country. So they're the ones in charge of security in the country, and they haven't really done that good of a job. And that has been noticed by everyone in the country. The big question though right now is if the opposition, if they get back to power that they lost in 2018, if they're going to take a different approach this time around. The reality is that unfortunately neither of the three candidates have been able to give a very concrete or radically new approach to security. I doubt it's going to be, we're going to go like El Salvador, for example, with a very paleo approach, or that of Ecuador that is going on right now as well. But definitely security is at the forefront of voters' minds as well. Another issue that's going to be extremely important in this election will be health. And this is a problem that was made by this administration. Mexico had a fairly robust healthcare system for developing a country for their standards. But this government has been sort of negligent in maintaining that system. And right now there is a huge shortage of medicine everywhere. Rural communities don't get access to healthcare anymore. In fact, the current administration scrapped the current institution, the institution that was in charge of healthcare. They tried to create a new one. That one failed. So right now they're scrambling to sort of find an alternative. So healthcare the lack of healthcare is a big sort of discussion right now in Mexican politics. And it's something that this is going to work against Morena, because like I mentioned, this was a problem made by the current administration. This is something that the opposition can argue, saying we did manage to sort this out, or to create a successful healthcare system in Mexico. And it was Morena who brought it down. And the third one, which is just starting to emerge, would be climate change, but also sort of the energy demand. So as you mentioned, Mexico is an incredibly big country of almost 130 million people. And with climate change, heat is getting much worse in Mexico, particularly northern and southern areas. So that demands more electricity from people. And in recent weeks, Mexico has had a lot of blackouts. And throughout the whole country, is not concentrated to an area. And there have been warnings that the Mexican electrical grid just cannot keep up with the demand right now. So there's also been on the presidential debates questions on how candidates are looking to solve that problem of yes, transitioning to a greener economy, but also at the same time making sure that Mexico can maintain that energy sovereignty that is very essential to Mexicans.
And how has Gálvez and Sheinbaum addressed this energy problem in debates or in policy outlines?
That's a great question. So, for Sheinbaum, who Morena party, it's a left-wing party on paper, but they're a very weird type of left wing. They are their own thing in a way. So things that you would traditionally associate with a left-wing government, they do not subscribe to. And one of those things, for example, is climate change. The president, although he publicly claims that he believes in climate change and that we should do more about it, all his policies have been moving away from that and more towards into fossil fuels. So for example, he built a massive oil refinery in southern Mexico in his which he promised he was going to have ready within 3 years of his administration, but it's been almost 6 years and he hasn't finished it yet. Obviously, as you know, oil refinery, huge pollutant for the area. He's had other projects which haven't been necessarily environmentally friendly. So it's a bit weird because they claim to care for the environment, but yet they're doing that. So it's a bit unclear of Sheinbaum whether she's going to move on from that or invest more heavily on clean energy. She has been quite alluding to she has been quite careful in what she says. She hasn't been committing to one side or the other, primarily because of what I told you earlier, that part of the whole Morena thing is López Obrador. So she's trying to play her cards right and not necessarily upsetting by going sort of in the opposite direction as him. So I think for Sheinbaum, we are yet to see. She has expressed interest in investing in more clean energies, but at the same time, people are doubting whether she will actually go against the big projects that the president has done in the last administration. As for Gálvez, she has been a lot more vocal on moving away from fossil fuels, investing in green energy. Mexico, due to its location, and vast territory, does have a lot of potential for hydroelectric power, wind energy, solar energy as well. I think the biggest solar energy farm in Latin America is actually northern Mexico, if I'm not mistaken. So the potential is there to really be a leading country in clean energy. It's more whether Gálvez will have the budget to build the infrastructure to sustain that moving forward.
And you mentioned that Morena is kind of a left-wing party, but doesn't have necessarily always left-wing policies or traditional left-wing policies. Where does Gálvez lie? Where does her party lie on the political spectrum? Is she also left, or is she fall more on the conservative side of things?
That's a fantastic question, and one that Mexican analysts are still trying to figure out. Xochitl Gálvez, her becoming a presidential candidate was very unlikely. So her story is remarkable. An indigenous woman from a very poor background, had a very abusive alcoholic father who hit her and her mother. She left on her scholarship to go study university, in Mexico City, made something of herself, became a very successful entrepreneur, which then launched her political career. And up until the election, she was a very well-known senator in Mexico. And what made her well-known is that she had no affiliation to a political party. So because, like I said, Mexican politics right now are so polarized, a lot of people are now trying to sort of move away from parties and center more on people, which is something that Xochitl did. So when the parties were doing the primaries for their parties, for their candidates, Xochitl wasn't a viable option because she didn't have a candidate, and it was civil society who demanded that she be on the ballot. That forced the parties, the three coalition parties, to sort of take them under their arm and sponsor her campaign. Now, that has given her the platform that she needs to run a successful presidential campaign. But at the same time, now people associate the bad policies of the past with her because she's now part of those parties. Even though on paper she's not militant to any of those parties, people now, and that's something that, for example, Morena and Sheinbaum have been trying to capitalize on, saying, oh, she is the party of all the awful policies that have been going on in the past that we've been trying to overcome. So Xochitl is in a bit of an awkward position because she has to defend her own ideals, but at the same time, thread a careful line and not piss off the parties too much. So overall, I'm going to say she's center right. So very pro-business, very small government, giving tax breaks to people so they can really launch their businesses. Socially, on some issues, for example, she's quite left-wing as well. Pro-LGBT rights, which are now enshrined in the Constitution, so she wouldn't be able to change that anyways. On very pro-feminist causes, very pro the environment, as I just mentioned. But at least fiscally, I would say she's slightly more center-right. But again, that is yet to be seen, considering how unique her position is.
Gotcha. I guess one more question, playing off the issues, is you mentioned the issues that you think are the most important to Mexicans in this upcoming election, but often there can be a disconnect between the issues that are being voiced by the candidates and voices and issues that actually matter to people. So is there anything that the candidates are talking about a lot that is not necessarily super important to voters?
No, I would say actually it's interesting. What's going on is, I think, especially the ruling party, Morena, they're trying to take issues that are vastly negative and against them and sort of minimize those problems. And that has really caused them a lot of political points. So a great example of that would be security, where Sheinbaum And López Obrador claimed that under them, Mexico is much safer, a lot less homicides, less violence against women. Which if you look at the own government figures, that is vastly untrue.
Mm-hmm.
So there is this really weird sort of disconnect of what people really feel and how insecure they feel on their day to day, and what the ruling party and their candidate Sheinbaum feel like what Mexico is. I feel like they genuinely believe that Mexico it's much better off security wise than what it actually is. Of course, the political campaign is based on a lot more issues than just security, but considering how dire the security situation is in Mexico, that has taken a big sort of chunk of the political discourse around this election.
Could you give me a rough idea? Because for somebody who's not studied and followed Mexico politics very closely, what are we talking about when you say that the security situation is dire? Is it number of people being murdered, the number of um, crimes being committed has gone way up? Like, is this a situation like um, pre what the new president of El Salvador? Like, is it just that crime and homicide has spiked way up?
Yeah, it's definitely that. So for a comparison, this has been the deadliest administration on record in terms of homicide. So last administration, which was from 2012 to 2018, there were roughly 150,000 homicides in Mexico. And this administration, who wanted to half that number, at least half it, now has roughly 180,000 homicides and counting, because the current administration is not over. What you also have right now is the cartels in Mexico going after areas that traditionally were not considered cartel territory. A great example of this would be Chiapas. Chiapas is a state in southern Mexico, which um, depends how you look at it, but if you look at the country as a whole, was relatively peaceful up until the past few years, where cartels have been fighting for that territory, primarily because it's a prime smuggling spot for Central American immigrants who want to go to the United States. They first to get into Mexico, and criminal organizations and cartels have greatly benefited from that business in terms of desperate people willing to pay to get into Mexico and then therefore the United States. So that, for example, that's something that was not a problem in the last administration. You have now a very relatively new but very violent cartel called the New Generation Jalisco Cartel, which is a lot more violent than its predecessor. So normally cartels would be quite content with the territory that they have, and they will sort of try not to step on each other's toes, because then that just brings the attention from law enforcement. But this new cartel sort of wants to create a name for themselves. So they've been going after territories that traditionally belongs to other groups. But they're quite violent in doing so. They're not as subtle as other cartels, like the Sinaloa cartel, for example. So there's a lot more, for example, something that the government tries to sort of sell to you. It's like, yes, it's a lot of violence, but most of this is intercartel violence. It's not citizens. It's sort of them killing each other. And that, unfortunately, has been the strategy for this government security-wise. Their strategy has been sort of, we're going to let them sort of sort it out. And once they do, violence will hopefully come down, which that has greatly backfired on them.
And last question: how much can the president that wins, the candidate that wins, actually do if their ruling party does not win a majority in either of the legislative chambers?
That is a fantastic question, and I'm glad you're in with that, because what I was going to say is I feel like there's too much emphasis on the presidential election, where I feel the Chamber of Deputies and the Senate races are going to be incredibly important as well. The reason why I say this is because when López Obrador won, he had a majority in both chambers, but he didn't have an absolute majority, meaning he could pass bills, but he couldn't make changes to the constitutions, which requires a 2/3 majority. So he didn't have that. And that was sort of what frustrated most of his progress. And because he had so much power in the presidency, simple majorities in both chambers, so many governorships under his belt, really the only check left on his government was the Senate and the Chamber of Deputies. So this election, if Sheinbaum wins, Morena's priority is also to get an absolute majority in both chambers so they can speed run a package of reforms that they're trying to, which have been highly controversial. Some of them good on paper, but not necessarily realistic once you look at it. So, for example, promise from the current government is if they win and they get a supermajority in Congress, they're going to change the law so that everyone gets their pensions are 100% of their last salary, which is ideal on paper, but once you do the math, it's just not possible. You look at very developed countries like Germany, the Nordic countries, for example, and they don't even do that. They do something like 70 or at most 80% of their last salary as people's pensions. So yes, the presidential race is important, but I think the real last counterweight on the presidency in Mexico will be Congress. So there is various scenarios. The most likely scenario will be that Sheinbaum wins, but her party doesn't get a supermajority on Congress. So there's that bit of a gridlock that has been going on the past few years. Second most likely one is that Xóchitl wins, but that her party also doesn't have a majority on Congress, so that gridlock wins. And then one of the less likely scenarios, which would perhaps be the most worrisome one, would be Sheinbaum wins and Morena gets a supermajority in Congress, because then there would be no effective check on the executive from Congress.
And is that 2/3 separately in each chamber, or is it 2/3 altogether?
Separately.
Okay. Well, Marco, that was fantastic. Thank you so much for that insight into the Mexican election. And I hope all of you listening really learned something, because I certainly did. So once again, thank you, Marco, so much for doing this.
No, it was my pleasure, Nathan. Again, thanks so much for having me. And again, for those, do keep an eye out on Latin American elections, not just Mexico. But I feel like Latin America is often an underdog in geopolitics. And I feel like for the reasons I just stated, this election is in Latin America, but particularly in Mexico, are quite important.
Well, we will try to stay informed and stay up to date on elections that are happening globally, but particularly in Latin America. So appreciate that.
No, anytime, Nathan.
All right.